Hey all, Siege here, and in today's video, I want to discuss the interaction at the end of the War Within quest and what I think that specific incident represents, as well as what very well may have actually happened. Now, like most of the stuff on the channel, this is just a theory based on information in the game, so it's obviously up for debate and subject to change with future content. But for now, what I want to review is the moment we were first introduced to the concept of the man on the wall. Now that we have a few quests after the fact to garner some more insight from, I want to go a bit further with the Tenno, their shadow, and the three answers that the Tenno can give while talking with Teshin at the very end, because I believe it has a lot to do with specifically what happened on the Zariman 10-0, the birthplace of the Tenno. We get quite a few potential flashbacks regarding that incident to flesh out the events leading up to, well, whatever actually did happen there in the Queen's dialogue. Now, although I still believe the Zariman was sent into the void specifically for, let's say, a reaction, I also have to stress that I now believe the ship did contain both adults and children, something the lore entry for Ember Prime briefly discusses as potential misleading information, but the Lotus explains that kind of away during this quest, saying that almost every bit of discernible data from that faithful ship had been erased or covered up, save for the Tenno, which would line up with that concept. But here's what I've been thinking about. Regarding the event where the Void had essentially overtaken the Zariman during its trip from the Fold and Saturn to the Outer Gates, given what we now know from the Chains of Hero quest, the Rel webcomic, and the dialogue from the War Within quest, the largely accepted explanation is that the saturation of the Void was such that the adults on the ship were driven mad, leaving the children frightened and confused as to what was going on, as well as being imbued with some type of power they had little control over. I think what's important here is the idea that in space, light years away from their actual home, trapped on a cursed ship with only their family insane and hostile potentially toward them, the visualization of all this would be a lot for a child to process and even more so deal with in any legitimate way. Yet, from the wording of the lore and the fact that, we're all here, at least some of them made it back just fine. Better than fine in many significant ways, Even Rel, who was essentially shunned and not included with the initial Tenno, Margulis was attempting to work with, which I think in itself is significant. Now, how is that possible? Well, I think the obvious answer is their newly acquired connection to the Void, and as I mentioned earlier, while I do feel this was a staged interaction by the Orokin, what's important is that the Tenno were born, and I believe this happened out of a combination of opportunity, necessity, and some healthy manipulation. Here's what I mean. During the three interactions at the conclusion of the War Within quest, we get our first true encounter with whatever entity the man on the wall is, and what I want to focus on are his answers because I think it speaks specifically to how the Tenno were in fact able to survive the Zariman. So, what I want to pose to you is a question, but first, I want you to visualize something for me. Close your eyes if you want. I personally think it helps, and it'll give you a break from my bad editing skills, so everyone wins. Now, imagine being a kid in space, on a ship that had been completely ravaged. Imagine your own parents turning on you, appearing to go mad, seemingly even trying to bait you out for God knows what. If you thought they were a threat, with it seeming that they no longer even knew who you were anymore, what would you do? If you can visualize that, it's probably not inconceivable for you to also be able to visualize that some of the parents on board were probably even successful. And while we can debate on why the madness only affected the parents, potentially the children's innocence shielded them, or the Void took a liking to them, or the one I personally believe was what the Orokin knowingly offered the children to the Void, what we know is that those kids were infected with something, essentially made immortal, and were able to not only fend off the adults, but kill and disintegrate every one of them, as the Ember Prime Codex states. After all, if they were able to capture and contain them in makeshift prisons, some of them would have been left on the ship to be discovered by Colleen, don't you think? Here's the relevant portion of her report found in said codex. Upon being asked about the condition of the vessel, Colleen states, Zariman was lost, making the Fold from Saturn to the Outer Gates. Mechanical failure. I notified families and filled a report with the inspectors. Nothing ever returns from the Void, so I closed the case. But you reopened the case days later. I didn't believe myself until I stepped upon the ship. It was completely intact, full environment, as if it had never left. and the crew was gone. Not exactly. We thought it was empty, but we began to find her face twitched at remembered pain. We began to find children hiding in the ship. Interestingly enough, this appears to be conflicting info from what the Queen states regarding the condition of the ship. And what I think is important with that is it's entirely possible both pieces of information are actually correct. This reality could have been viewed by the Tenno and their parents as a product of the void, driving the parents insane, but in reality might have only been in their head, or at least in the collective unconscious of them all, which can be very real and would in fact line up with the mind-body narrative the story has been trying to convey. Regardless, what I feel this led to was the initial interaction with the void entity, essentially coming to the Tenno at their time of need and offering the power to save themselves if they so chose. I think this is why the three interactions play out as they do. If we look at the Kuva as, say, a metaphor for the void power itself, each one works as a reminder of their initial choices based upon the concepts of the Jungian shadow I went over in my last video. Something I'll leave a link to at the end of the video and in the comment section if you haven't seen it and want better context. In the Sun response,
"You mad at me, kiddo? Did you forget? You owe me.
the entity reminds us that suppressing what happened doesn't alter the debt we owe them for giving the power to fight back, something those who generally suppress anger and frustration often wish they had, even though they often feel bad about doing it, even if it is justified, and would understand all too well the concept of laying the abhorrent burden of vengeance and aggression on something else, such as the void. In my opinion, the void is making sure the Tenno just don't ever forget that. Now, moving on to the second response. I think this lines up again with the fully integrated shadow, synonymous with a balanced individual.
Don't forget, kiddo. You're nothing without me."
And that there can be no light without the darkness and vice versa. So too is it in how the children would not be the powerful entities they are today without the void power. And I think you could make the claim that the void is more by having the Tenno as a kind of arm in the physical world, being able to interact with it through them. Symbiotic, if you will. Finally, we have the moon choice, which I find to be the most humorous because it perfectly mimics another line that I think so thoroughly encapsulates the same concept.
"Hey, kiddo. What took you so long?"
You never even hesitated.
Now, if you know where that came from, you know what it led to. And in this instance, it fully matches up with the embrace concept, essentially asking us why it's taken us so long to drink the Kuva, given that this type of Tenno has been fully consumed from the very start. I imagine it was these individuals that led the first hunting parties and were potentially those who initially shunned Rel, embracing the newly unleashed chaos within freely. Now you might be asking yourself, so what's your point? Well, I got to thinking about how frequently it seems the void attempts to trick us. You know, we see it at the end of the sacrifice quest with the false appropriation of Isa's death. I think we see a very skewed perspective of the new war in parts, led by the Man in the Wall specifically, something the latest installment of the new war supports as well, and the Lotus's uncertainty with things. There's an obvious narrative the void is at least attempting to make the Tenno and quite possibly anyone that has had any interaction with it believe. And given how the void works, kind of like another dimension laid right on top of our own, this wouldn't be terribly difficult to do. I mean, the reason the moon was able to be hidden while essentially staying in the same place, how Limbo can be in the void and back so freely, and even the Tenno for that matter. Given that one dimension can be laid upon another with such power as to completely remove the moon, seemingly from our own plane of existence, I want to put to you something I really hate to think about, but is the theory and the reason for the video today. What if the parents never went mad? What if the biomes hadn't been sabotaged? The food stocks hadn't been dwindled? What if there were no fires raging on the lower decks? What if the void never affected the adults at all? What if this entire tragedy happened as a product of a vision given to the children in order for them to choose what they would become? That's right. Imagine hallucinations forcing a person to see things that aren't really there. Well, at least in the physical body world, that is. But in the mind, anything's possible. Interestingly enough, it would make the information from both the Ember Prime Codex and the Queen's dialogue correct, in a matter of speaking. The only one I can think that would. But what do you think? Could the Tenno have killed their own parents? Being manipulated by the Void, essentially making them the aggressors instead of it being self-defense as we've been meant to believe? Regardless, I feel like the Void manipulations at this point should be fairly obvious. Not everything we see or hear is accurate, or if nothing else, we're not seeing the entire picture. It makes me wonder why that is. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed the video today. It's one I've been thinking about ever since I finished last week's video regarding the Shadow, and it's something I think we still have more to talk about in the future. But for now, hope you all have a wonderful day, wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.